How the hell can a stuff up this big happen?
And yet they haven't picked the nuclear option. Why would that be?
If you know Nigel Farage, what they weren't expecting is Nigel Farage to fight back.
In recent months, here on the Aussie Wire, you've heard me say that we get the government that we deserve. In other words, if we wanted better government, we would need to become better people. Sadly, this harsh reality came into sharp focus this week as the Victorian human rights abusing dictator Daniel Andrews finally saw his popularity drop sharply. It didn't drop when he locked down the state and lied that it wasn't about getting to 0 cases of COVID. His popularity didn't drop when he arrested pregnant mothers and shut down playgrounds, nor when he locked down whole apartment buildings, for which taxpayers are now paying compensation, by the way. Not even deploying armoured cars and firing rubber bullets and then claiming that he had, and I quote, always supported the right to protest. Not even that absurdity, that flagrant abuse of human rights and frankly psychopathic ability to lie with absolute sincerity, not even that was enough to cause a major dip in his polling. And despite the efforts of many good people, he won re-election even after passing laws that undermine the very heart of our democratic system and which were described by legal experts as laws the Stasi would be happy with. And ever since that election, I've had a steady stream of people who come to me and ask me if I think the election was stolen. Surely, they say, that couldn't have been the free and fair result after all he'd put the people of Victoria through. And I always tell them the same thing. No, the election wasn't stolen. It's worse than that. It wasn't stolen. And Victoria really is getting the government that it deserves. Now, it's easy to laugh at Victoria, but honestly, look at what we have nationally. And then, if you really want to make yourself angry, look at what passes for an opposition in this country. Our alternative government. No, we are most definitely getting the government that we deserve. But good news, finally Dictator Dan's polling has dropped. He's falling out of favour. Could it be that his violent, deceitful human rights abusing past is finally catching up with him? Could it be that the people of Victoria are finally waking from their fever dream and throwing off the shackles of the worst and most oppressive Premier in Victoria's history? And that is saying something. I wish I could pretend that that's what's happening here, but it's not. Premier Andrews' popularity has dropped because he cancelled the the Commonwealth Games. As the Roman Republic turned into the Roman Empire, and that in turn became oppressive, decadent, and began to crumble from within, the Roman historian Juvenal spoke of the use of bread and circuses, and how it seemed the emperor was untouchable, no matter how poor his rule or how oppressive his policies, as long as the Roman citizens had bellies full of bread and circuses to entertain themselves. It seems that Australian citizens are no better, and Premier Daniel Andrews enjoyed rock-solid support through all of the absurdities and abuses of his more than 10-year reign, as long as the welfare flowed freely and the entertainment was laid on thick. I'm looking forward to the end of Daniel Andrews' reign as Premier, but I would have liked to have seen him thrown out of office by people awake to his abuses and determined to never let another like him anywhere near the levers of power. Alas, it seems that the hard lessons have not been learnt, and if this last week is anything to go by, it seems that we haven't learned anything in 2,000 years. We still fall for bread and circuses. We get the government that we deserve, and even though I'm pleased to see Daniel Andrews' popularity finally dropping, I don't think it's for the right reasons, and I don't think it's proof that we deserve someone better. To deserve someone better is going to require us, those of us who see the problem, it's going to require us to have honest conversations with people who don't yet see the problem. Most of us were raised not to discuss politics, religion, or money. But honestly, I think that's terrible advice that serves those in power. If we don't talk about it, then there's a good chance that we and those around us don't understand it. And almost no chance that we're going to do anything about it. We saw that only too clearly during the COVID lockdowns. People didn't understand, and most people did nothing about it. Those subjects, politics, religion, and money, can be tough, there is no doubt, and they need to be handled carefully for sure. But in a democratic system where the person across the dining table from you has a vote that is just as valuable as yours, I think it's vital that we actually talk about these things. If we want a better government, then we need to become better people. And if you're already awake to what's going on and already opposed to the rule of the worst human rights abuser in Victorian or, frankly, Australian history, then you can't really do much more yourself. You're already voting against him and you're already speaking out against him. But now it's about reaching others, one-on-one, person to person, and showing them the reality of the world they live in and the reality of what modern politics has become. Teach them that this stuff matters, that it's okay to have an opinion and it's okay to do something about it. Clearly, we've got work to do. For now, it's time for the news. Well, if you're online the way that I am and you follow the people that I follow, you would have seen a lot of news and noise about the debanking of Nigel Farage. A lot of celebration on one side, a lot of consternation on another. This is a developing story and quite a lot has changed actually in only just the last few days and weeks, and I thought it was time for a catch-up on all of this story. And I brought Alex's story. No pun intended on your name there, Alex, but Alex, thank you so much for coming back onto the Aussie Wire. Now, Alex, just having a bit of a hard time hearing you there. Hopefully your mic will be okay. Now, what we've seen just recently here is the revelation. Some information has come out from within the banks themselves. Nigel's lawyers were able to get a hold of some things. Claims were made that the bank account was shut down because Nigel was no longer in a financial position where he should have an account at such an exclusive bank like Coutts. We now know that that's not true. Can you talk us through that?
I think that that's a really important development. Initially, when Nigel Farage, who is a presenter on our new TV station in Britain called GB News, he just made the point that his bank had debanked him, or at least his bank was threatening to close his bank accounts down. And then he also added that it was very difficult for him to find a bank that wanted to provide services to him in the aftermath of that debanking. And of course, what then happened very quickly is, because he has an audience, a counter move was essentially prepared. And we now know that Alison Rose more or less briefed, or Coutts and NatWest briefed the BBC and the FT, and we know that they briefed them because the vocabulary used in both reports were essentially very similar. The bank briefed the media and essentially lied. They said, we are getting rid of Nigel because he just doesn't have the cash to be at Coutts. And of course, what then happened is that the BBC ran with it. They dislike Nigel Farage intensely. So this was a really good way of showing Nigel, the loser, losing his bank account. But of course, one of the things that they weren't expecting, and that really always surprises me if you know Nigel Farage, what they weren't expecting is Nigel Farage to fight back. And that surprises me because Nigel Farage has always fought back. But anyway, so he then asked his lawyers to ask for some documents, which then legally were needed to be released. And essentially, it's called a subject access request, and so he lodged that. The bank was had to show how they came to the conclusion that he had to be debanked. What was interesting there is that when the 40-page report came out, the word Brexit came out over 30 times. The word skeptical of gender politics came out regularly. Then his skeptical views on the lockdown, on the COVID lockdown, also came up, and his friendship with Trump. And then you realize that actually he was debanked not because he didn't have any cash in the bank, but because his views, as the report itself stated, their views didn't coincide with Nigel Farage's. Therefore, he ought not to have a bank account with them. And of course, for all of us who like debate, who like the idea of exchanging ideas on controversial topics, that's quite dangerous. And then we realized, as that story blew out, that it wasn't just Nigel Farage who was debanked. It was a series of people. In fact, he mentioned there was a group of 10,000 people on Facebook, who many of which, as singular individuals within that group, were debanked as well. And so by coming out with his story, what he also enabled others to do is to realize that they themselves had been debanked for similar reasons. So it's a very important story, and it tells us, as he says, where things are going. Mm-hmm. We are moving towards a Chinese style a social credit score system.
Sure.
And so, of course, I think that that's a very, very important story, and I'm glad that you picked it up.
Well, it is quite extraordinary to see this happening in what is thought of as the home of modern democracy. We see that so many of our freedoms, so much of our system of government, which was designed to protect freedom, we've inherited from you in the UK, and it really does seem, with arrests for people making Facebook posts that aren't according to the zeitgeist of the day, people being debanked for having the wrong views. It certainly seems like it's a concerning time there in the UK. Can I put a question to you, Alex? These kinds of situations put me in a bit of a bind. I am a libertarian. I'm a free speech absolutist, but I'm also a free association absolutist. So I do believe in the right of any private organisation, so long as they're not receiving government funding, to choose who they will and will not interact with, including their clients, and that they have the right to do that on whatever basis they deem to be the important basis. It's entirely up to them. Now, of course, you and I and Nigel have absolutely the right to then draw attention to that and to try and find out what those reasons are and to make that public and let the chips fall where they may. Do you have a different perspective on that? Do you agree with me on that? This is an area where I really do find myself wrestling.
I think in this case, I think it's because Coos lied about the reason why they debanked Nigel. That's, for me, the crux. Mm. The initial reason they gave would have been good enough had it been true.
Yeah.
Had it been the mandate of the bank to only have clients with over $1 million in cash or £3 million in investments, because it's a private bank, these are the criteria, that would have been fine. But that's not really why they did it, and that's the reason why the story is so important. Had it been a commercial reason, had there been the commercial reason, and had it been proven, then it would have been fine. What we then see is that actually, when that report came out, it was due to the fact that they didn't like his political views. And so what that means for people like us is that suddenly we're seen, if we hold certain kinds of views, as not deserving of banking services. And in many ways, we're seen as evil. And that's the reason why we're entering such dark waters, because you and I might disagree intensely about a topic, but somebody, for me, on the left or on the right with whom I disagree is not somebody who is evil. It's somebody who has views that I don't agree with. But we're now entering a phase of discussion or of polemic in the world where somebody on the left can attack anybody on the right because he sees them as evil and not deserving of any human treatment. And that's the key. That also leads to a slight disagreement with you, which is, it doesn't matter. The bank could still not want to bank Nigel Farage because they just don't want to.
Sure.
Which is also a good point to make, and that's the one that you're making. My view is that having lied and having tarnished the reputation of one of their clients unnecessarily, that's why the story. That's the crux of the story. That a bank can make its own decisions. That's fine. And of course, the thing that we then have to look at is how other banks then collude together to exclude people with certain political views.
Sure.
And of course, there's a fundamental thing in Britain, which is that banks are not allowed to kick somebody off their platforms legally for political reasons.
Sure.
And so that's, I think, so in other words, in many ways, they broke the law and they defamed one of their clients.
Well, as is so often the case with these things, it's the cover-up and in this specific case, the defamation that is certainly coming back to bite them. I want to go one step further, though, because I think there's actually a massive and largely unrecognised risk to directors of any organisations that are getting so deep into this ESG, that environmental, societal and governmental kind of score system that they have. There is a fiduciary duty for every director of every company that is publicly traded to act in the best interest of their shareholders. And in fact, doesn't even have to be publicly traded. It just has to be external shareholders other than the director themselves. They have to act in the best financial interests of those shareholders. But we're seeing here decisions being made from, in this case, a bank, but we see it all the time in a lot of different companies, where decisions are now being made on the basis of how it impacts their ESG score. And I do wonder, and this is from me just speculation, but I'd love to get your thoughts on this. Are we likely to see lawsuits in coming years and perhaps coming decades as companies go further down this path, as shareholders begin to wake up and realise that their share values or their dividends or both have actually been harmed by the directors not honouring their fiduciary duties?
On this point, we are already there. I mean, the fact is, when the CEO of a bank tells you that NatWest or Coutts is more than just a bank, and they will fight the climate and they will push for more gender rights and everything else, you know already on shareholder value, and they might somehow in a Byzantium way try to explain why it is that it's good for shareholder values. But in the end, the moment they say that the specific description of their corporate is no longer what they should focus on, then you know that they're not doing the best for their shareholders. So in that way, we see an enormous amount of corporates across the Western world that are no longer keeping their eyes on the ball. And in fact, in many ways, you can see this because the FTSE 100 or the CAC or the variety of stock exchanges across Europe are not a great deal higher now than they were in 1999. In many cases, they were flat. So there's been no real return for shareholders over the last 2 or 3 decades, well, at least 2.5 decades. So the eye off the ball thing, ESG, has already happened. The issue, I think, is simply on the shareholders waking up and taking their cash and moving elsewhere. Is that we are now in an ETF universe where you have big players like BlackRock and others who own all the capital, and they themselves become the decision makers as to where the cash goes. And so we have an extra layer of the investment manager that has become politicized itself. So it's much more difficult for the shareholder through the offices of the ETFs that they've bought or the investment managers that they use in order to invest their pensions to go straight to the source and get some kind of rectification via the courts on that topic.
Well, I still hold out hope, maybe only a fool's hope, but I would be getting the popcorn warmed up, that is for sure, should we begin to see those sorts of lawsuits happening. Alex Story, thank you so much for bringing us up to date on what's happening with this bank account situation. I've got a feeling that this has got a couple more months to run with some twists and turns, but I do applaud Nigel Farage for pushing back, and I thank you for bringing us this update.
My pleasure.
I'm thrilled to be speaking at the Church and State Conference in Perth on August 4th and 5th. I'm giving a keynote, participating in a panel, and will of course be at the always excellent gala dinner on the Saturday night. Tickets are still available, and the next 20 people to use the code Topher10 when they book will get a 10% discount. I love supporting events in Perth, both because it's a great city full of great people, but also because Perth often misses out on these sorts of things. So I'm very happy to be heading to Perth once again. And if you can get there, please join me and support me as I support the Church and State Conference in Perth. The ticket link is in the description. Well, we've all heard the news about the Commonwealth Games being cancelled in Victoria. It has caused shockwaves and outrage. Unlike other things that Daniel Andrews has done, I find it quite curious, and I thought I would chat with someone who's been right in the thick of things, in fact, right in Spring Street and the House of Parliament itself. David Limbrick, MP from the Libertarian Party of Victoria, thank you so much for joining me here on the Aussie Wire.
Thanks for having me.
You and I have seen a lot. You've seen things from the inside of Parliament House. I've seen things from the outside of Parliament House. But I haven't seen outrage directed at Daniel Andrews quite like what we're witnessing now over the cancellation of the Commonwealth Games. What do you think is going on here?
I think people feel a collective embarrassment about it because it was a big commitment, big song and dance by Victoria. It was brought to the election, and then all of a sudden they say, oh, sorry, we can't afford that now. So people feel, I think, firstly, they feel embarrassed for the state of Victoria. I know I feel embarrassed about it. And secondly, they're like, how the hell can a stuff up this big happen? Like, just about every project they runs over budget. So the idea that this one wouldn't run over budget is fantasy. But yeah, I think there's that collective embarrassment that people are upset about.
I find this whole chapter really interesting because Daniel Andrews has shown himself not to be too terribly concerned about how he spends money. We're spending, how many billions is it? Over 100 billion, I believe, on this urban rail link. Extraordinary amounts of money. And now all of a sudden he seems extremely concerned about the budget, and he cuts the one thing that could have hurt him. He cuts, if I may be so bold, the circus that he was going to be putting on for the people of Victoria. Why do you think he's chosen this? Did he not predict the fallout?
I'm not sure. Like, he certainly needs to, they need to rein things in. I think their biggest fear at the moment is getting our Victorian credit rating downgraded. They managed to avoid that with the budget because they did make some expenditure cutbacks. They did raise some taxes, which kept the credit ratings agencies happy. And I think they were concerned that if this, goes over budget, that the ratings agency might take another look at us. And for those of you who aren't familiar, what that actually means is effectively it becomes more expensive for Victoria to borrow money. And we're through selling bonds, which is the way that we borrow money. And, we're already paying millions and millions of dollars a week in bond payments. And that would get worse if our rating got downgraded. So financial reality has forced them into this place, I think.
Well, this is what I find interesting. He seems so divorced from financial reality, and in many ways he seemed immune from any kind of unpopularity. What does it say about us? If it's true that we get the government we deserve, what does it say about us and about Victorians that this is what it took for Daniel Andrews' popularity rating to finally dip below 50%, given what we've seen in the last few years?
Look, I think that they've gone through a bunch of options, and they've determined that this option, for whatever reason, is the least damaging. Now, they could have done what we suggested and cancel the suburban rail loop. As you mentioned earlier, it's far, far bigger project, far more likely to run, end up in overruns. But, can you imagine the industrial strife that would come of that? Now, with the games, they're sort of trying to remediate some of that damage by going out and building some of the stuff that they said was going to be long-term infrastructure anyway. They figure that they can, get away with that. And because the whole idea was it was pitched towards supporting regional communities. They're going to try and say, well, we're doing that anyway. We're just not using the games to do it. But I can sort of see how cancelling the suburban rail loop, as much as I'd like it, would cause them massive trouble with unions.
Now, if my memory serves me correctly, and I've only just remembered this now, I didn't look it up before this recording, Daniel Andrews, one of the first things he did when he got into power was to rip up the East Link, the Eastern Freeway link that was going to build a tunnel through to the Western, the Tullamarine Freeway, if my memory serves me correctly. A move which cost us, Victorian taxpayers $1 billion just to not build that piece of road. Do we have any idea yet how much it's going to cost Victorian taxpayers to not host these Commonwealth Games?
No, we don't know yet. And you're right, it cost us $1 billion to build nothing back at the start of this government. And we don't know. So it's actually unknown at the moment because the government is in the process of negotiating those contracts. They sent negotiators to the UK apparently, and they came back under a stalemate. So we don't know how much it's going to cost to get out of those contracts. I imagine it's going to be very adversarial.
Well, I see absolutely no reason and absolutely no incentive why the various other parties to these contracts would want to act in good faith now, having been slapped in the face the way they have. If I were them, I'd be trying to extract as much blood as I possibly could, sadly, at the expense of Victorian taxpayers. Well, look, that's all we've got time for. But David Limbrick, MLC, member for the Libertarian Party in Victoria, thank you so much for your time. And boy, I do hope that this is the beginning of people paying more attention to politics down there in Victoria.
Thank you.
We keep being told that net zero and this great energy revolution is the great priority of our time. But if you're listening to other guests of mine that I have on a regular basis that are actually getting out and speaking to people in the real world, the likes of Graham Hood and Malcolm Roberts and so many others that are out there speaking to ordinary Australians, they're not very interested in net zero. They're not very concerned about carbon emissions. And it turns out that actually they're not alone. Whilst our government and our political elites might be obsessing over the issue, there are some parts of the world where they're actually abandoning their renewable energy targets. I'm joined today by Joanne Nova, our science correspondent here at the Aussie Wire, to discuss some recent news. It came out a couple of weeks ago, Joe, but this is an unexpected development, I have to say, an unexpected little bit of sanity from a global, a world-class country, let's just say.
Well, and not just a world-class country, but, Sweden topped the EU list for renewables share of energy in last year's tally. So it was quite the star of renewable energy. But as it happens, when we look more closely at this, what's happened is that they elected a more right-wing government last September. And then, yes, if we look at the energy swing in Sweden, you can see that 30 years ago, back in 1990, they were pretty much half hydro and half nuclear, which is, as low carbon and renewable.
Job done. Job done.
Yes, it was solved 30 years ago. And anyway, then they had to do the fashionable thing and invest in all the bioenergy and the wind and the solar, a tiny little slither of solar. They're a long way from the equator there. And it hasn't worked. It's been expensive. It's been difficult. And even though they're called a star of renewables, the answer to having low carbon energy is, of course, not renewables at all, but nuclear. And so they're just going back to what they had before. And cost is, and as well as stability. I mean, their finance minister, Elizabeth Svantesson, said in Parliament, we need more electricity production, we need clean electricity, and we need a stable energy system. So they are looking at building at least 2 small modular reactors and extending the life of the reactors they already have. So in a sense, it's not a big shift, but in a mental sense, this is a big shift because they have gone from having a 100% renewables target by 2045 to being 100% fossil free.
Yeah.
So don't get me wrong, we're not looking at free markets and freedom and what we would hope for, but at least, this is still a pagan antipathy of the 6th element of the periodic table, as I say on the blog, but it's a more pragmatic version of that bizarre sort of primal hatred of carbon. So, yay for Sweden.
A little bit of pragmatism is what's really needed here. And the likes of Bjorn Lomborg and Matt Ridley and so many others have made this case for years now. And I know you've been commentating on this as well. If you really do believe that carbon dioxide emissions, that man's emissions of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere are driving this impending global catastrophe, then you should be embracing nuclear. This makes perfect sense. This is the gift, the goose that lays a golden egg. I don't even know what metaphor to use, but this is the solution to your problem. If they're saying we have this impending catastrophe, but we're not going to use nuclear, then you have to question how much they really believe this is going to be a catastrophe.
Exactly, Topher. You've hit so much on the nub of all of this. Nuclear fission reactors have been around for 50 years. It is a very old, tried, tested and well-known technology. France has been running almost up to 70% of its entire electricity provided by nuclear. And yet, for some reason, people have known about this CO2 problem, as they call it, the crisis, the greatest threat to mankind, the existential problem on Earth. and yet they haven't picked the nuclear option. Why would that be? Maybe because it solves the crisis. If you all went nuclear, there is no crisis, really. And actually, there's no crisis anyway, to tell you the truth. But I think if you look at the way Greens and big government aficionados make their choices, you can always pick the way they'll go by whether it's independent power or whether it is dependent on the government. And any power source dependent on the government is a friend indeed of big government. So they will choose every time to ignore the solutions that can compete on their own in the market, and they will pick up the things that require government subsidies and assistance, because that becomes a fellow lobbyist for big government non-stop.
We're seeing this growing nexus, and I'm moving away from science here into sort of, I guess, geopolitics and political theory, but we're seeing this growing nexus between big, often multinational companies, but certainly big corporate interests and governments, where there's long been this assumption that regulators are there to keep the corporates under control. They're acting on behalf of the populace, on behalf of the little guy, to keep those naughty businesses under control. But there must be a growing realization in more and more people. You've certainly had this realization for a long time. I was a bit slower than you, but I had this realization a long time ago that actually what's happening is we're seeing governments using regulators to actually get into bed with business and vice versa, and that these people are basically using each other at our expense. And this appears to be yet another industry where that's happening.
Indeed, the unholy alliance of big government and big corporations is all too easy to sort out. Once it gets started, it picks up momentum, and it is a bit of a frightening combination because, you know, we the people, how important are we? The governments certainly don't seem to be making decisions based on what they think the voters will want. They seem to be making decisions for other reasons, and hence Australia has a net zero agreement that no one voted for, but here we go.
Yes, indeed. Look, energy is going to be an issue that, in a way, I hope will become self-correcting. And people are going to take me out of context here and take this the wrong way. But if it gets bad enough, it's an issue where people will feel the pain as it gets less and less reliable and more expensive. And it's the kind of issue that could trigger a genuine pushback. There are other issues that people can ignore, but energy reliability and energy affordability is not one of those. It's a pain that people feel.
Well, and that's absolutely right, Topher. And I guess the challenge for all of us is to get the message out to people, because they've been hit with 30 years of propaganda that wind and solar are free and cheap, and not with the more complex kind of understanding that you need an energy grid that will provide energy all the time. You can't store electricity in a shoebox. You can't come back later and pull it out when you need it. It's got to be there in the second. And it's just such an incredible thing that we have in Australia a grid that's 5,000 kilometres from top to bottom, running from the tropics to the far temperate zone. And those electrons in the grid are just back and forward at 50 hertz. It's an amazing thing that it works. And to mess with that, with energy that's unreliable, unstable, that comes and goes. And so I'm starting to refer to solar and wind as the vandals on the system, because they might be cheap for the hour that they run, but they force everything else on the grid to be more expensive. We need more transmission lines, more storage, more stability. The coal plants get less efficient because they're running less hours in the day, but they've got to cover all the costs they have to cover anyway. And they've got to do it in less hours. So, of course, their costs are going up. So, you know, a lot of people can't see this, the way adding cheap solar and wind, cheap being just, as I said, on a 1 hour or a half an hour kind of cost basis, makes your 24-hour electricity so much more expensive.
Well, the bid stack and the way that gets manipulated is a topic that we're covering in small bits and pieces over time here at the Aussie Wire. So regular viewers will have some window into what you've already talked about, and we will be touching on it more as time goes on. But Joe, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for bringing us yet another great story here on the Aussie Wire. Thank you for watching the Aussie Wire News. If you appreciate what we're doing, then please support us by becoming an Aussie Wire Insider, where you'll get giveaways, discounts, exclusive content, and our amazing insider community, and all while helping us to bring you the news that focuses on truth, freedom, and hope. We release new episodes of the Aussie Wire News on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 4 p.m. You can catch up on past episodes at theaussiewire.com. Don't forget to join our email list while you're there, and you can follow us on all the socials at the Aussie Wire. I'm Topher, and this is the Aussie Wire News.